The galaxy was full of powerful species. Some had ruled entire star systems for thousands of years. Some had weapons that could crack planets in half. And among all of them, humans were considered the least interesting. They were small, soft, short-lived, and their homeworld was a tiny blue rock on the outer edge of a quiet spiral arm. Most alien civilizations looked at humanity the way a grown adult might look at a child playing in the mud. Cute, perhaps, but certainly not important. That was exactly why Queen Zaleith of the Dominari Empire chose a human for her mate. The decision had been political from the start. Zaleith had ruled the Dominari for 11 years, and her empire was the largest in the known galaxy. Her people stood over 7 feet tall, with silver skin that shimmered like liquid metal, and 4 long, graceful arms that moved with a kind of beauty that made other species feel clumsy just watching. They lived for centuries. They had conquered dozens of worlds, and Zaleith sat at the top of it all, alone on a throne made of crystal and starlight. Her council had been pressuring her to take a mate for years. A proper Dominari mate would come with political alliances, military expectations, and centuries of obligations. Zaleith was tired of all of it, so she made an announcement that shocked the entire Galactic Federation. She would take a mate from one of the lesser species. A symbolic gesture of unity, she called it. A way to show that the Dominari Empire welcomed all beings as partners, not just subjects. Her council hated the idea. But Zaleith was the queen, and when she made a decision, the galaxy moved around it. The humans were chosen specifically because they were harmless. They had no great fleet, they had no ancient bloodlines, or political factions that could complicate things. A human consort would be decorative, obedient, and easy to control. That was the theory, at least. The selection process was handled by a joint committee of Dominari officials and human diplomats. Hundreds of candidates were reviewed. The Dominari wanted someone calm, presentable, and thoroughly unremarkable. They did not want a scientist who might ask too many questions. They did not want a politician who might try to gain influence. They wanted someone simple. They found Jake Harris. On paper, Jake was perfect. He was 34 years old, born in a small town in the American Midwest, and he had spent the last 6 years working as a cargo logistics officer aboard the Federation transport vessel Starbound. His performance reviews described him as reliable, quiet, and cooperative. He had no criminal record, no political affiliations, and no family complications. He was, by every measurable standard, the most average man in the candidate pool. He had kind brown eyes, a calm face that did not show much emotion, and hands that were rough from years of physical work. When the selection committee interviewed him, he answered their questions simply and honestly. He said he understood the responsibility. He said he would do his best. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not boast or make promises. He just sat there, steady and patient, like a man who had learned a long time ago that the world did not owe him anything. The committee loved him. He was exactly what they wanted. What they did not know, and what no standard background check could reveal, was that Jake's service record had a hole in it. 3 years were missing, not deleted or corrupted, but sealed under the highest security classification of the United Earth Military Command. The kind of classification that required 3 generals and a parliamentary vote to open. Before Jake had become a cargo officer on the Starbound, he had been someone else entirely. Lieutenant Jake Harris, serial number 7742 Alpha, of the 1st Orbital Drop Regiment. Call sign, Blackout. The drop regiments were humanity's most elite combat units. They were the ones who dropped from orbit in armored pods, landed in the middle of enemy territory, and fought their way out or died trying. Jake had done it 14 times, and walked away from every single one. He had fought in the siege of Calyx Station, where a Vraxian boarding party had torn through the outer decks and killed 200 crew members in the first hour. Jake had held a single corridor for 9 hours alone, using nothing but a standard-issue rifle, 2 grenades, and the broken body of a blast door as cover. When the relief team finally reached him, they found him sitting against the wall, covered in blood that was mostly not his own, calmly reloading his weapon. He had not called for help once during those 9 hours. The communications panel had been right next to him the entire time. He had been awarded the Silver Eclipse, humanity's highest military honor, in a ceremony that was classified. No cameras, no press, just a quiet room, a medal, and a handshake from the commander of Earth's entire military, who looked at Jake like he was not entirely sure the young man standing in front of him was fully human. After that, Jake had been pulled from active duty. The official reason was psychological decompression and long-term reintegration. The real reason was that the military did not know what to do with a man who had done what Jake had done and still slept soundly at night. They gave him a quiet job on a transport ship and hoped he would fade into the background. And he did. For 6 years, Jake Harris moved cargo, filled out shipping manifests, and ate lunch alone in the mess hall of a ship that nobody important ever visited. He became invisible, which was exactly what he wanted. Until the day the Dominari Selection Committee pulled his name from the database and decided he would make the perfect harmless husband for an alien queen. The night before he left Earth's orbital station for Zaleith Prime, Jake received a secure communication from Colonel Nate Grady, his former commanding officer. Nate was older now, his hair gone gray and his voice rougher, but his eyes were still sharp. He told Jake that military intelligence had been watching the Dominari for months. Something was moving inside the Empire, and they did not know what. He told Jake that his position beside the Queen could be more useful than any spy satellite or covert agent they had ever placed. Jake listened to all of it without interrupting. When Nate finished, there was a long silence. Then Jake said he would keep his eyes open. That was all. No dramatic speech, no patriotic declaration, just a quiet man agreeing to walk into the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy with nothing but his eyes, his instincts, and a lifetime of training that no one knew about. He arrived on Zaleith Prime 3 days later. The shuttle landed in the grand courtyard of the Crystal Palace, and Jake stepped out into air that smelled like flowers he had no name for. Everything was tall and bright and impossibly elegant. The buildings rose like frozen music, all curves and light and glass. Dominari guards lined the walkway, each one a full 2 feet taller than him, their silver faces expressionless. Queen Zaleith waited for him in the Hall of Eternal Light. She stood at the center of a room that seemed to have no ceiling, just open sky and drifting clouds of golden light. She was the tallest person Jake had ever seen, and the most striking. Her silver skin caught the light and scattered it like a prism. Her 6 pale violet eyes studied him the way someone might study a small and mildly interesting insect. Jake walked up to her, stopped at the proper distance, and bowed. Then he straightened, looked into her eyes without fear or nervousness, and said it was nice to meet her. Zaleith blinked. She had expected stammering, or awe, or fear. She got none of those things. She got a calm man with rough hands and a simple smile, who looked at her like she was just another person in the room. She smiled back, amused. This one, she thought, would be very easy to manage. She had no idea how wrong she was. The first weeks on Zaleith Prime were slow and strange. Jake was given a suite of rooms in the royal wing of the Crystal Palace, with ceilings so high he could barely see the top. Everything was made for people twice his size. The bed was enormous. The chairs were too tall. Even the door handles were placed higher than felt natural. He adapted without complaint. He found a smaller chair in a storage room, carried it to his quarters himself, and placed it by the window that looked out over the palace gardens. That became his spot. The Dominari court did not know what to make of him. To them, he was a curiosity at best and a joke at worst. The nobles whispered when he walked past. Some did not bother to whisper at all. They called him the Queen's pet, the little human, the toy from the outer rim. A few of the bolder ones made comments directly to his face, testing him. Jake smiled politely at all of it. He thanked them for their honesty. He asked if they were having a good day. Most of them walked away confused, which seemed to bother them more than if he had fought back. Zaleith watched all of this with growing interest. She had expected her human consort to be overwhelmed, perhaps even frightened, by the grandness of Dominari civilization. Instead, Jake moved through the palace like a man who was comfortable being uncomfortable. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not seek attention or approval. He simply existed, quietly and steadily, like a stone in a river that let the water flow around it without being moved. She began inviting him to her evening meals. At first it was curiosity, nothing more. She wanted to understand how such a small and fragile creature could seem so entirely at peace in a place that was clearly not built for him. But the meals became conversations, and the conversations became something she had not expected. Jake asked her real questions, not the flattering, rehearsed questions her courtiers asked, designed to gain favor. He asked her what it was like to rule a people who lived for centuries. He asked her if she ever got tired of making decisions that affected billions of lives. He asked her what she did when she was not being the queen. No one had ever asked her that last question before. Zaleith found herself talking to him for hours. She told him about the pressure of ruling, about the loneliness that came with a crown no one else could wear, about the way her own council members looked at her and saw only a symbol instead of a person. Jake listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions. He just listened. And sometimes he nodded. And once in a while, he said something short and honest that made her stop and think. One evening, he offered to cook for her. She was amused by the idea. The royal kitchen was staffed by 40 chefs who had trained for decades in the art of Dominari cuisine. Jake walked in with his sleeves rolled up, asked politely for a few basic ingredients, and made her a simple pasta dish with garlic and olive oil. The kitchen staff watched in horror. The queen of the most powerful empire in the galaxy was eating food prepared by a human in a kitchen that had never seen a clove of garlic in its entire existence. Zaleith took one bite and laughed. It was not the most sophisticated thing she had ever tasted, but it was warm and honest and made with care, and she ate every bit of it. After that, Jake cooked for her twice a week. It became their private ritual, something that belonged to just the two of them in a world where everything else belonged to the Empire. But while Jake was building trust with the Queen, he was also doing what he had been trained to do. He memorized the guard rotations within his first 10 days. He mapped every corridor, every entrance, every blind spot in the palace security grid. He identified which guards were loyal to the Queen, and which ones answered to someone else. He noticed that Commander Drevos, the Queen's chief military advisor, had a private communication channel that bypassed the royal network entirely. He noticed that supply ships arrived at the western docking platform every third night, always after midnight, and that the cargo manifests for those ships were sealed. He reported all of this to Colonel Nate Grady through a micro-encrypted transmitter hidden inside a simple wristwatch. The device was so primitive by galactic standards that the Dominari security scanners passed right over it. They were looking for advanced technology. They were not looking for a tiny radio that ran on a watch battery. Nate connected Jake with Danny Cole, an old squad mate from the Drop Regiment days who now worked deep cover intelligence on a Federation station 2 systems away. Danny was loud, reckless, and brilliant. He fed Jake context that raw intelligence alone could not provide. He told Jake that the Dominari military faction had been quietly increasing weapons production for months. New ships were being built in hidden dockyards. Troop movements were being disguised as training exercises. And at the center of all of it was Commander Drevos, a man who had served the Empire for over a century, and believed, with absolute conviction, that aliens had no place in Dominari affairs. Jake absorbed all of this and said nothing. He continued to cook meals, take walks in the garden, and sit with the Queen in the evenings like a man who had nothing on his mind but the beauty of the twin moons rising over the palace. But there was one moment that almost gave him away. It happened on a quiet afternoon in the lower corridor near the servant quarters. Jake was walking back from the gardens when he saw a young Dominari servant girl carrying a tray of crystal glasses. She was small by Dominari standards, barely 6 feet tall, and clearly nervous. She tripped on the edge of a rug, and the tray went flying. The glasses shattered across the stone floor in a burst of bright, ringing sound. A guard standing nearby reacted immediately. He stepped toward the girl and raised one of his 4 hands to strike her. It was casual, almost automatic, the kind of punishment that was so common in the palace that no one even looked up when it happened. Jake caught the guard's wrist before the blow landed. He did not grab it hard. He did not twist or pull. He simply caught it in midair and held it perfectly still like he had reached out to catch a falling cup. But the guard could not move his arm. He tried. He pulled. He shifted his weight. Jake's grip did not change. The guard was a trained Dominari soldier, 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and the strength of 3 human men. And this small, quiet human held his wrist in place like it was pinned to the wall. Jake looked at the guard with his calm brown eyes and said that accidents happen. He said it gently, like he was talking to a friend. Then he let go. The guard pulled his arm back and stared at Jake with all 4 of his eyes wide. He did not say a word. He turned and walked away quickly, rubbing his wrist. Jake knelt down and helped the servant girl pick up the broken glass. He asked if she was all right. She nodded, but she was staring at him the way someone stares at a locked door that just opened by itself. She had seen what he did. She knew that what he had done was not normal. Above them, on a balcony overlooking the corridor, Queen Zaleith stood in silence. She had seen everything. She watched Jake walk away with his hands in his pockets, calm and unhurried, as if nothing had happened. She tilted her head slowly to one side. Her 6 violet eyes narrowed. For the first time since she had met him, she wondered what her quiet husband was truly made of. There was something behind those calm brown eyes, something patient and controlled and much, much deeper than anything his file had suggested. She did not say anything to him that evening, but when he brought her dinner and sat across from her with his usual easy smile, she studied his hands. They were rough, scarred in small ways she had never noticed before. The hands of a man who had done far more than move cargo on a transport ship. Zaleith sipped her drink and smiled at him, and said the food was wonderful. And inside her mind, for the first time, a small and quiet alarm began to ring. Commander Drevos had served the Dominari Empire for 137 years. He had fought in wars before Zaleith's grandmother had been born. He had watched empires rise and crumble across the galaxy, and through all of it, he had held one belief with absolute certainty. The Dominari were superior to every other species in existence, and any leader who forgot that truth was a danger to the empire itself. He had tolerated Zaleith's rule for years. She was competent, he admitted that much. But she was soft. She believed in diplomacy and partnership, and the ridiculous idea that lesser species could stand as equals beside the Dominari. And now she had taken a human as her mate. A human, the weakest, most fragile, most laughably insignificant creatures in the galaxy. Every time Drevos saw Jake Harris walking through the palace, with his small frame and his calm little smile, something inside the old commander tightened like a wire being pulled too far. But Drevos was not a reckless man. He was patient. He had spent decades building his network inside the military, placing loyal officers in key positions, redirecting resources to hidden shipyards, and quietly preparing for the day when the Empire would need a stronger hand at the wheel. That day, he decided, was coming soon. His opportunity arrived during the Festival of Twin Moons, the most sacred celebration in the Dominari calendar. The entire empire paused for 3 days of feasting, music, and ceremony. It was also the one time of year when the full council gathered in the capital, which made it the perfect moment to apply pressure. 3 days before the festival, a border skirmish broke out with the Rithani Confederacy. A Dominari patrol vessel exchanged fire with a Rithani scout ship near the contested Velox system. 2 Dominari crew members were injured. The Rithani claimed it was a misunderstanding. Drevos claimed it was an act of provocation that demanded an immediate military response. Jake knew the skirmish was staged. The timing was too perfect, the damage too minor, and the Rithani had nothing to gain from provoking the Dominari during a festival season, when the entire empire was watching. He had seen this kind of play before, back in his military days. Create a crisis, then offer yourself as the only solution. It was the oldest trick in every species playbook. In the emergency council session that followed, Drevos stood before the Queen and her advisors and made his case. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had been preparing this speech for a long time. He said the Rithani threat was growing. He said the Empire's borders were vulnerable. He said that the Queen's policy of peaceful engagement had left the military underfunded and unprepared. And he said, with great respect and humility, that the Council should grant him temporary expanded authority over military operations to address the threat before it became a disaster. Half the Council immediately agreed. Drevos had spent years making sure of that. The other half looked to the Queen. Zaleith sat on her throne and said nothing for a long time. Jake stood behind her, and to the left, in the traditional position of the royal consort. He was not supposed to speak in council sessions. He was barely supposed to be noticed. But he watched Drevos the entire time, and he saw what others missed. The way Drevos's lower left hand twitched when he mentioned the border incident. A small tell that Jake had catalogued weeks ago. The way 2 council members glanced at Drevos before raising their hands to vote, checking for his approval. The way the entire room was being steered, gently but firmly, toward a conclusion that had been decided long before anyone sat down. Zaleith asked for time to consider. Drevos's smile stayed perfectly in place, but Jake noticed the brief flash of frustration in his pale silver eyes. The commander had expected an immediate vote. The Queen had just bought herself time, and Drevos did not like surprises. That night, Jake found Zaleith alone in her private study. She was standing by the window, looking out at the twin moons with her 4 arms crossed tightly against her body, which Jake had learned was a Dominari sign of deep stress. He walked in, sat down without being invited, and told her plainly that she was being pushed into a corner. Zaleith turned to look at him. Her 6 violet eyes were cold. She told him that she did not recall asking for the opinion of a cargo officer on matters of imperial security. Jake did not flinch. He told her to look at the pattern. The border skirmish came exactly when it would cause the most pressure. The council votes were already lined up before the session started. The supply shipments to the western docking platform had increased by 30% in the last 2 weeks. And Drevos's private communication channel had been active every night for the past month. He told her that someone was preparing for something much bigger than a border response, and that she was being maneuvered into giving that person the authority to do it legally. Zaleith stared at him. The room was very quiet. Outside, the twin moons cast long silver shadows across the floor. She asked him, slowly, how a logistics officer from a transport ship had noticed all of that. Jake met her eyes and said that you learn to read a room when your survival depends on it. She did not press him further. But something shifted between them in that moment. She looked at him differently after that night. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a new kind of awareness, like someone who had been looking at a painting and suddenly realized there was a second image hidden beneath the surface. Over the following days, Zaleith began to push back against Drevos in small but deliberate ways. She delayed his requests for expanded authority. She questioned his logistics reports publicly, pointing out inconsistencies that she never would have noticed on her own. She reassigned 2 of his loyal council members to ceremonial positions that sounded prestigious but carried no real power. Each move was subtle enough to look routine, but Drevos felt every one of them like a needle. He began to suspect the human. He sent 2 of his personal enforcers to test Jake. They found him in a quiet corridor near the gardens one evening, and staged what looked like a drunken argument that spilled into his path. The first enforcer bumped into Jake and snarled at him. Jake apologized, stepped aside, and wished him a good evening. The second enforcer was more direct. He blocked Jake's path and shoved him in the chest. Jake absorbed the shove by stepping back smoothly, turning the force into distance rather than confrontation. The enforcer threw a real punch. Jake shifted his weight, redirected the enforcer's arm, and guided it into the stone wall beside them, with a clean, precise motion that looked almost accidental. The enforcer's fist hit the stone hard. Jake caught him before he fell, steadied him, and apologized for the misunderstanding. Then he walked away. The enforcer reported back to Drevos 30 minutes later, holding his swollen hand. He told the commander that the human moved like water. He said he had been trained by the best combat instructors in the Dominari military, and he had never seen anyone redirect force that smoothly. He said the human's eyes had not changed at all during the entire exchange. Not a flicker of fear, not a flash of anger. Nothing. Just those calm brown eyes, watching everything like a man counting cards at a table. Drevos sat in silence for a long time after the enforcer left. Then he pulled up every available record on Jake Harris. The file was clean. Work history, medical records, education, family background, everything checked out. But there was a gap. 3 years with no records. No employment, no address, no medical visits, nothing. Just a blank space in the middle of an otherwise ordinary life. Drevos had seen blank spaces before. He knew what they meant. They meant that someone with a great deal of authority had decided that whatever happened during those years was too dangerous to leave on paper. He did not know what Jake Harris had done during those missing years. But he knew, with the instinct of a man who had survived 137 years of politics and war, that the human sitting quietly in the Queen's garden was not what he appeared to be. He began to accelerate his plans. Whatever he was going to do, he needed to do it before the human figured out how to stop him. 2 systems away, on Earth's orbital command station, Colonel Nate Grady received Jake's latest intelligence report. He read it twice, leaned back in his chair, and called in a tactical analyst named Lisa Dunn. He told her to quietly move the Earth frigate Pale Horse into the neighboring system and keep it on standby. He told her that something on Zaleith Prime was about to break, and that when it did, he wanted to be ready. Lisa asked him how bad it was going to get. Nate looked out the window at the stars and said he honestly did not know. But he said that Jake Harris was the best soldier he had ever commanded. And if Jake was worried, then everyone should be worried. Drevos launched his coup on the anniversary of Zaleith's coronation. He had chosen the date with the precision of a man who understood the power of symbols. The Queen would fall on the same day she had risen. The Empire would remember that. The first move came at midnight. Palace guards loyal to Drevos sealed every entrance to the royal wing simultaneously. The locks were overridden using military command codes that only Drevos and the Queen were supposed to have, which meant he had been planning this for far longer than anyone suspected. Communication relays were jammed across the entire capital. No signals in, no signals out. In orbit above the planet, a heavy warship called the Iron Veil locked its weapons onto the capital city. It was not there to fire. It was there to make sure no one tried to resist. Zaleith was in her private chamber when the lights changed. The soft golden glow of the palace shifted to a cold emergency blue. She stood up and reached for her communication panel. It was dead. She reached for the door. It was locked from the outside. Jake was 3 corridors away when the lockdown hit. He had been walking back from the kitchens, carrying a plate of food he had made for the Queen. When the lights changed, he set the plate down on a window ledge, closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and opened them again. The calm, easygoing man who cooked meals and told quiet jokes was gone. What replaced him was something older and colder, and completely still. He moved through the palace in the dark, like he had been born in it. Every corridor he had memorized, every guard position he had catalogued, every blind spot in the security grid he had identified months ago. He avoided 2 patrols, slipped through a service passage that the Dominari had forgotten existed, and reached the royal wing in under 4 minutes. 2 guards stood outside Zaleith's chamber. They were Drevos's men. Jake recognized their faces from the rotation patterns he had tracked. He came up behind them so quietly that the first guard did not know he was there until Jake's hand was already on his neck, pressing the nerve cluster that sat just below the Dominari jawline. The guard went limp. The second guard spun around, reaching for his weapon. Jake stepped inside his reach, locked one of the guard's forearms against his own body, and used it as leverage to bring him down. Both guards were unconscious in less than 5 seconds. Neither one had made a sound. Jake opened the door and found Zaleith standing in the center of her chamber, with her 4 arms at her sides, and her 6 eyes burning with a fury that could have melted steel. She was not afraid. She was angry. Someone had dared to lock the Queen of the Dominari in her own room. Jake told her they needed to move. She asked him what was happening. He said Drevos had made his move, and that they needed to get to the throne room before he consolidated control. He said it simply, like he was telling her the weather. Zaleith looked at the 2 unconscious guards on the floor, then back at Jake. She did not ask how a cargo officer had done that. There was no time. She nodded, and they moved. They reached the throne room through a series of back passages that Jake navigated from memory. When they arrived, the great doors were already open, and the room was full. Drevos stood at the base of the crystal throne, with 50 armed soldiers behind him. Members of the council who supported him were arranged in a half-circle, their faces a mixture of triumph and nervousness. At the edges of the room, a handful of Zaleith's loyalist guards knelt on the floor, with weapons pointed at their heads. Drevos turned when Zaleith entered. He did not look surprised. He had expected her to find a way out of her room eventually. It did not matter. The throne room was his now. He addressed her with a formal speech he had clearly prepared. He spoke of the Empire's decline under her leadership, her dangerous alliance with inferior species, her failure to protect Dominari interests. He spoke of duty and tradition and the sacred bloodline of the Empire. And he said, with the tone of a man delivering a verdict that could not be appealed, that the Queen was no longer fit to rule. Zaleith stood tall and did not give him the satisfaction of fear. She told him that treason did not become poetry simply because he had rehearsed it. Drevos ignored her. He turned his attention to Jake, standing quietly beside the Queen, and gestured to 2 of his soldiers. He told them to remove the human pet. He said the word pet slowly, like he enjoyed the taste of it. The 2 soldiers walked toward Jake. They were tall and armored and confident. They had never fought a human before. They did not consider it fighting. Jake waited until they were within arm's reach. Then he moved. The first soldier reached for Jake's shoulder. Jake caught his wrist, twisted it inward, and struck the nerve cluster beneath the soldier's second arm with the flat of his other hand. It was the same weak point Jake had spent months studying during formal dinners and court ceremonies, watching the way Dominari moved, the way their forearms connected to their bodies, the places where the muscle was thin and the nerves ran close to the surface. The soldier gasped, his arm went dead, and Jake drove him to his knees with a single downward pull. The second soldier swung a heavy fist. Jake ducked under it, stepped behind the soldier, pulled the weapon from his belt, and shoved him forward into his falling companion. Both soldiers hit the ground. Jake straightened up, holding the alien rifle in both hands, with a grip that was practiced, familiar, and completely wrong for a man who had spent 6 years counting cargo boxes. The throne room went silent. Jake looked at Drevos and said in a voice that carried across the entire room that the commander had made a serious miscalculation. Drevos stared at him. The amusement was gone from his face. He ordered his remaining soldiers to take the human down. They came at Jake in groups. He used the throne room itself as his weapon. He fell back to the wide crystal pillars and used them as cover, forcing the soldiers to approach in narrow lines where their numbers meant nothing. He moved up the steps of the throne platform, using the high ground to control distance. He targeted officers first, the ones giving orders, the ones holding the formation together. When they fell, the soldiers below them hesitated, and Jake punished every hesitation. He fought the way water moves through rock, not with brute force, but with direction and patience and an understanding of exactly where to apply pressure. He used their own momentum against them. He redirected strikes into walls and pillars. He disarmed soldiers and used their own weapons for exactly as long as he needed before dropping them and moving on. He never stayed in one place for more than a few seconds. He never made a sound louder than a breath. Zaleith watched from behind a pillar where Jake had pushed her at the start of the fight. She watched the man who had peeled vegetables in her kitchen and told her gentle jokes about Earth's weather move through 50 trained Dominari warriors like a blade through silk. She watched him break a soldier's weapon arm with clinical precision and then step over the fallen body without looking down. She watched his eyes, and what she saw there was not rage or hatred or bloodlust. It was focus. Pure, absolute, terrifying focus. The kind that came from years of training and years of practice and something deeper than both, something that could not be taught. 7 minutes. That was how long it took. 7 minutes from the first strike to the last soldier hitting the floor. When it was over, Jake stood in the center of the throne room, breathing evenly, surrounded by the wreckage of Drevos's personal guard. Most of them were alive. Some would need medical attention. A few would not walk the same way again. But Jake had killed only those who had given him no other choice, and even those deaths had been quick and clean. Meanwhile, 2 systems away, the jamming signal over Zaleith Prime had triggered an automatic alert on the Earth frigate Pale Horse. Lisa Dunn had been waiting for exactly this. The ship jumped into the system within minutes, broadcasting on every open frequency that Earth considered any threat to its citizens a hostile act, and would respond accordingly. The Iron Veil, Drevos's warship in orbit, suddenly found itself facing a human vessel with its weapons armed and its shields at full power. The Dominari crew hesitated. That hesitation was all Zaleith's loyal naval commander needed to seize back the orbital defense grid and lock the Iron Veil in place. In the throne room, Drevos was the last one standing. His soldiers were down. His warship was neutralized. His council allies were pressed against the walls with their hands raised. He looked at Jake with something that might have been fear and might have been respect, and was probably both. He drew a ceremonial blade from his belt. It was a long, curved weapon made of black metal, old and sharp, and meant for exactly this kind of last stand. He lunged at Jake with the speed of a man who had been a warrior for over a century. Jake sidestepped the blade, caught Drevos's primary arm at the elbow, twisted it until the weapon dropped, and in one fluid motion locked all 4 of the commander's arms behind his back, using a hold that pinned each limb against the others. It was not a standard technique. It had been designed specifically for Dominari anatomy, practiced over months of quiet observation and preparation, and executed now with the calm certainty of a man who had known this moment was coming long before Drevos had ever decided to act. Jake held the commander on the floor and said quietly that it was over. Zaleith's loyalist forces broke through the outer doors 4 minutes later. They secured the throne room, arrested Drevos and his supporters, and restored the Queen's authority. The coup, which had been planned for years, collapsed in less than an hour. And in the center of it all stood Jake Harris, a man the Dominari had chosen because he seemed like the most ordinary human alive, standing in the ruins of a rebellion he had taken apart with his bare hands. The days after the coup were filled with silence and confusion. The Crystal Palace, which had always hummed with the noise of politics and ceremony, was suddenly very quiet. Guards walked the corridors in pairs. Council members moved through the halls with their heads down and their voices low. The servants cleaned the throne room and tried not to look at the cracks in the crystal pillars where bodies had been thrown against them. No one talked about what had happened, and no one talked about the human. But everyone was thinking about him. The story spread through the palace first, then across the capital, then across the entire planet, and then across the galaxy. The details changed depending on who told it. Some said the human had fought 100 soldiers. Some said he had fought them with his bare hands. Some said he had not been touched once during the entire battle. The truth was slightly less dramatic, but no less extraordinary. 50 soldiers, 7 minutes, 1 man, and when it was over, he had calmly asked someone to check on the Queen. The Dominari court formally requested Jake's sealed military record through diplomatic channels. The request went all the way to Earth's Parliamentary Defense Committee, where it sat on a desk for 2 days, while very serious people argued about how much to reveal. In the end, they released a partial dossier. Enough to explain what had happened, not enough to compromise anything that was still classified. The file described Lieutenant Jake Harris of the 1st Orbital Drop Regiment. It listed his 11 major combat deployments. It described the siege of Calyx Station in dry military language that made one of the most brutal engagements in human history sound like a routine operation. It noted that he had held a single corridor for 9 hours against a Vraxian boarding party, alone, without calling for support. It noted that he had been awarded the Silver Eclipse in a classified ceremony, and it noted at the very end that he had been removed from active duty and reassigned to logistics for long-term psychological reintegration. The Dominari read this file and did not know what to do with it. The species they had considered weak, primitive, and harmless had produced a man who could dismantle an elite fighting force in minutes, and they had sent him into the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, disguised as a nobody. Some Dominari were angry. Some were impressed. Most were simply unsettled, because it forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about humanity. Zaleith read the file alone in her private study. She read it twice, slowly, letting every word settle. Then she closed it and sat for a long time, staring at the twin moons through her window. She summoned Jake the next morning. He arrived in her chamber wearing the simple clothes he always wore, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. He looked the same as he always had. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. There was no difference between the man who had cooked her dinner and the man who had dismantled a military coup. They were the same person. He had simply been showing her one side while keeping the other carefully out of sight. Zaleith stood by the window, with her forearms folded tightly across her body. She did not look at him immediately. When she finally turned, her 6 violet eyes were filled with something complicated. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Not hurt, though that was there too. It was the look of someone who had been made to feel foolish, and who was trying very hard to decide whether that feeling was justified. She asked him if any of it had been real. Jake did not pretend to misunderstand the question. He stood still and met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something vulnerable in his face. Not weakness, just honesty. He told her that the intelligence work was real. He said he would not lie about that, or pretend it was something else. Earth had sent him with a purpose, and he had carried out that purpose. He had watched and listened and reported what he found. That part of who he was in the palace had been a mission. Then he paused, and his voice changed. Not louder or softer, just different. More careful, like he was choosing each word the way a man chooses his steps on thin ice. He told her that the rest of it was real too. Every meal he had cooked for her. Every conversation they had shared in the garden. Every evening when she had talked about the weight of the crown. and he had sat beside her and listened. He said those moments were not part of any mission. No one had told him to care about her loneliness. No one had ordered him to sit with her when she was tired and talk about small things that had nothing to do with politics or war. He had done those things because he wanted to. He told her that before he came to Zaleith Prime, he had not sat in a garden with another person in years. He said that the military had given him a quiet job on a transport ship after Calax Station, and that he had spent 6 years eating alone and sleeping alone, and moving through days that all felt exactly the same. He said that sitting across from her at a table, watching her taste something he had made with his own hands, hearing her laugh at something he said, those had been the first moments of real peace he had felt since he could remember. Zaleith studied him. She looked at his rough hands, the small scars on his knuckles, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, always ready, even now. She looked at his eyes, and saw the tiredness behind them, the kind that came not from lack of sleep, but from years of carrying things that were too heavy for one person. She realized something then. She had not been the only one who was lonely. She had not been the only one wearing a mask. Jake Harris had walked into her palace carrying a lifetime of war inside him, and instead of letting it define him, he had chosen to peel vegetables, and make pasta, and sit quietly in a garden. He had chosen gentleness, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to put the other thing away. She told him he could leave. Earth would welcome him back as a hero. The Dominari would not stop him. He had fulfilled his mission, and more. There was no reason for him to stay on a world that was not his, beside a queen who had spent months thinking he was something less than he was. Jake looked at her and asked if she wanted him to leave. The question hung in the air between them. It was simple and direct, the way everything about him was simple and direct, and it cut through every layer of politics and pride and protocol like a blade through paper. Zaleith said no. Jake nodded slowly. He walked to the chair by the window, his chair, the small one he had carried from a storage room on his first week in the palace. He sat down, looked out at the twin moons, and said that he had made a promise when he came here. He told her that where he came from, people kept their promises. Zaleith sat down across from him, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. They did not need to. The silence between them was warm and honest, and full of understanding. The kind of silence that only exists between two people who have seen each other clearly and decided to stay anyway. Across the galaxy, the story continued to spread. But it was no longer just a story about a fight. It became a story about what humanity was. The elder races had always measured species by their weapons, their technology, their size, their lifespan. By those measures, humans were nothing special. But the story of Jake Harris forced the galaxy to consider a different kind of strength. Here was a species that could produce warriors capable of standing against the best soldiers of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. That alone was unsettling. But what was truly disturbing, what kept alien commanders and diplomats and scholars awake at night, was that this particular warrior had spent months choosing not to fight. He had cooked meals, he had told jokes, he had knelt on the floor to help a servant girl pick up broken glass. He had held a guard's wrist gently instead of breaking it. He had done all of this while carrying the ability to bring down an entire royal guard with his bare hands. The humans had not sent a weapon to Zaleith Prime, and the difference between the two was something the galaxy was only beginning to understand. Colonel Nate Grady read the final after-action report in his office on Earth's orbital command station. He leaned back in his chair, looked up at the ceiling, and smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes from relief rather than joy. He had spent months worried that Jake would not come home alive. Now it looked like Jake might not come home at all, at least not to Earth. Nate was all right with that. Danny Cole, working from his intelligence station 2 systems away, sent one final encrypted message to Jake's wristwatch transmitter. The message was 3 words long. It said, "You beautiful, stubborn idiot." Jake read it that evening in the garden and laughed out loud. A real laugh, the kind he had not made in years. Zaleith, sitting beside him, asked what was funny. He told her an old friend had sent his congratulations. She smiled and said she would like to meet this friend someday. Jake said she would regret that the moment Danny opened his mouth. And in the garden of the Crystal Palace, beneath 2 silver moons, a queen and her human husband sat together in the kind of comfortable silence that most people spend their entire lives searching for. She had chosen him because she thought he was ordinary. He had stayed because she was the first person in a long time who had looked at him and seen a person instead of a soldier. The galaxy could think whatever it wanted. The elder races could debate and theorize and worry. But in that garden, on that quiet evening, none of it mattered. What mattered was this. 2 people who had been underestimated by the entire universe had found, against all odds and all reason, someone who understood what that felt like. And they had decided, simply and quietly, that they were done being alone.